Welcome to the 3030 Health Podcast. The following discussion is for education and entertainment. It is not intended to diagnose or treat disease. Please do not apply any of this information without first discussing it with your doctor. Here is your host, Dr. Ruiz.
Hello everyone, super excited about the show today. In today's show, I interview my dear friend Billy Mitchell and his mentor, Dr. Mitch Hopkins, and we discuss the science of infrared light and brain health. I hope you enjoyed the show. Hello everyone, this is Dr. Ruiz, and I have a super special show today. We have two of my favorite people, and I just met them, both of them. I have Dr. Mitch Hopkins here with me, and I have Billy Mitchell, one of my dear friends from Naturopathic Medical School. Dr. Hopkins is Billy's mentor, and Billy, a couple of years ago, I asked him, how did you end up in Naturopathic Medical School? And he said, well, because of Dr. Hopkins. So I decided to do something a little bit different. I'm going to have both of them on the show. So in true 3030 health fashion, Dr. Hopkins, what's your hero story?
Great question, Dr. Ruiz. Actually, growing up, my mom was a real hardcore nutritional fanatic, and we weren't allowed to have sugar and sodas and donuts and chips and all the great stuff that all my buddies had. And so, we had apples and raw organic vegetables and things. And so I really didn't like it at all. I would always sneak over to my friend's house so I could get a donut or a cookie. And I thought my parents were so mean. But as I grew up, I really now, in retrospect, I'm so grateful that she did, because so many of the issues of weight and acne and all different types of maladies that people are suffering because of the poor diet, I missed. And so I'm so grateful that my mom did that. And growing up, our doctor was a chiropractor. We went to an acupuncturist, an herbalist, and these were the people that when I got sick, that's who I went to. So it just seemed like the right thing. So I moved into that direction and became a chiropractor. Did that for a couple of years, but found that it just wasn't as fulfilling as I thought. And then I left my practice after 2 years, traveled across the country, and just basically hired myself out for hire for these different clinics that I thought that there was great nutritional or dentists, biological dentists, people that had amazing things to offer. And I would just work at their clinic till I learned what they knew, and then I would move on. So I spent years just traveling, working at these different clinics, figuring that I'll come back and open up a practice when I know what I'm supposed to know. And about 5 years later, came back, did a lot of what you were doing, hormone replacement therapy and doing diet. And then I worked at a clinic where I worked with elite athletes, where I designed their diet and nutritional programs for professional athletes, many of the Angels, the Dodgers, and many of the different professional football teams. So I did that for a lot of years. And then I've taught human anatomy at the college level for about 27 years now. And I've always been fascinated with the human body. And so lately, in the last couple of years, I've really become fascinated with the brain and just kind of moved off in that direction there. So I guess to answer your question, and I know it kind of went off on a tangent, the person that inspired me the most would be my mom.
It's a common thing that I say on the show, that my avatar or my perfect patient would be mom, because you fix mom and then you fix the whole family. And
correct.
Over and over and over, I see this repeating. And the reason is because mom controls the kitchen. The ROI on changing the diet is so huge. I believe like around 90% or 80% of the population would get much better without ever needing to go to the doctor, without ever needing to take a prescription drug or even a supplement if your diet is solid. And I know that, during one of your lectures, that's when you inspired Billy to change kind of like his career path. And that's when he decided to become a naturopath. But Billy, what is your hero story?
For me, it's, I was an atopic kid growing up. I had eczema and exercise-induced asthma, and I had chronic anemia that never really got resolved or figured out. I had a buttload of barium, that was done as part of investigation for that, and they never could really figure it out. But essentially what I learned was that there was so much I could do with nutrition and lifestyle modification. And so I had already been doing a little bit of this prior to meeting Dr. Hopkins in my undergrad at Vanguard University. And so I was reading a lot of the blogs that you read about, Chris Kresser, Rob Wolf, guys like this. And when I took his class, he was talking about a lot of the same things that they talked about. So I'll never forget the first time, you wrote cholesterol up on the board and pregnenolone, which was obviously not related to the big topic at hand, which was anatomy. But that was the stuff that really, got my gears turning in my head and got me excited. And it was just so cool to see somebody at that level of my education talking about this functional medicine stuff that was really neat. And learning from Dr. Hopkins and seeing these guys out there, eventually I realized that there were all sorts of people out there with many initials after their names saying these same kinds of things. And some of it, just flew in the face of everything that I had learned, like cholesterol is your friend. And, I was like, wow, that's kind of out there to think about, that it's good for you and useful. But so anyway, I had these things that I dealt with growing up that resurfaced. And so around this time, I was mostly focusing on being a track and field athlete and performing at the highest level I could. I sustained a knee injury that eventually led to a perforated ulcer through ibuprofen overuse. And I was a lot stupider then than I am now, and listening to my coaches who said that wasn't okay to do. I think I was taking on the order of something like 2,800 milligrams a day. And I was out on the trails with some of the guys, and I had all the signs and symptoms I learned about now leading up to that. But so I had this ulcer perforate, and a lot of those health maladies that bothered me as a kid came back, and some new ones too. And so I really had to buckle down and revisit all the things that I learned about, and just become really militant, which is the way I've always kind of been, because I like functioning at a high level, not only physically, but mentally. And so in learning about those things and some of the things that I learned from Dr. Hopkins, I thought it'd be really cool to share that with other people. And just the idea of working through complex health issues like solving a puzzle was really appealing to me. So it's really two-part. It's that desire to kind of be investigative and be a detective and problem solve, and then just how neat it was to me that you could turn on and off these health maladies like as if they were controlled by a light switch almost.
I guess like we all have like this journey, and we all have this the steps that we go through before we actually find exactly what we want to do. And through this journey, we fall into a couple of things. We fall into bias, and we fall into having to unlearn things. Billy mentions, how cholesterol is actually your friend, or by educating yourself that lipoproteins are a very different molecule than cholesterol. And all of these things. So Dr. Hopkins, how long have you been doing this health stuff, or how long have you been a part of this functional medicine space?
Graduated in 1988, and a buddy and I, we opened up our first practice in 1988, and I started working again with people, helping with diet, nutrition, supplements, lab-guided tests, so we could specifically tailor their nutritional to laboratory-guided test. So that was kind of the big deal back in the 80s. That was very few doctors were doing that, where they were using lab tests to validate the nutritional protocols. And so using that, it was kind of cutting edge at the time. So that was kind of fun. So I guess you would say in the late 80s.
Okay, so from the late 80s, so about 30 years almost. What are some things that have changed? And what are some things that we really got completely wrong? Up the top of my head, things like calories in, calories out, and then a couple of years later, Gary Tops comes out with that seminal book, Good Calories, Bad Calories, and then we start blaming insulin on everything. And then in the past 5 to 7 years, it's well, insulin does have a little bit to do with obesity, but it's not the whole story. So as scientists, we have to change with the evidence as the evidence is presented to us. What are some of the biggest things that we have gotten wrong in the past and that we're finally getting around to correcting?
Well, I remember back again in the late 60s and 70s when that whole cholesterol theory where saturated fat caused heart disease. So then what they did is they said switch from saturated fat to plant oils, vegetable oils. And so then they started this whole margarine thing, which was the American Heart Association said that this is a better alternative to butter. And so if you want to protect your heart, and so there was many commercials on there like Parquet, it's not butter, it's this. And so for over a decade, they were promoting this as a heart healthy alternative. Then they found out in the 90s, whoops, this margarine is actually a trans fats, and trans fats actually induce heart disease. Whoops, we're sorry. So, we had that going on for a long time. Fat makes you fat. We've seen now that it does just the opposite. Fat makes you thin. Carbohydrates make you fat. So there's been quite a few things. Right now we're seeing the big thing. We're in the big midst of sun exposure. If you stay out in the sun, you're going to die. So, lather up your kids, even if they're going to just go from the house to the car. You want to lather them up completely because, God forbid, the sun actually strike the kids. And so we're starting to see a lot of issues there where we're seeing suppressed immune system because we need the vitamin D to support our immune system. So honestly, there's been a lot of these things that have, over time, we've just had to kind of suck it up and, and say, whoops, we got it wrong.
If you had asked me about 5 to 6 years, what is the number one needle mover? Even when we started this conversation, I was talking about diet, and I would have been, without any question, diet is the number one needle mover. And then I met Billy, and Billy has convinced me and has changed my mind a little bit, not completely, that sleep is probably as important, if not more important, than diet. Why is that, Billy? Why is sleep so important?
Well, we've had several discussions over time, and my thinking is always evolving, depending on what I'm reading at the time and what else I'm exposed to. But, and Dan Party really well and the research he cites and how there's so much on just obesity driven by light exposure and disrupting your circadian rhythm, which makes it harder for you essentially to make the right dietary choices. And even if you are making the right dietary choices, the impact that sleep disruption and circadian disruption has on your metabolism is pretty drastic. Now I would say I think there's a few things that are clear to identify as the biggest needle movers. I would still lean a little bit more towards sleep than anything else, but it's definitely context specific. What's going on and what do we need to learn about the individual.
And they're not all isolated. They're not silos. As much as the conventional model has tried to slice us and dice us and make us into compartments, all of it has to fit within the puzzle. For example, toxic burden, sleep, diet, stress, even familial connections such as friendships and all of that fits into the model. And when you put all those pieces together, that's when you have true health. Now, within that, that silo or that individual aspect of brain health, I know Dr. Hopkins really nerds out on brain health. Can you tell us a little bit about like your research and some of your clients and the things that you have done with TBI and all that side of health?
I'd love to. Just to touch a little bit more on a couple things that I think is a nice segue into what I'm doing here is they've been doing a lot of studies, and what they find is lack of sleep. One of the biggest issues with lack of sleep is increased insulin sensitivity. So what they find is even if you miss 1 hour of not getting the adequate amount, which they say is about 8 hours, for one night, they already see a dramatic loss of sensitivity to insulin. When you become insulin insensitive, this is all of the issues that it's one of the primary drivers. So lack of sleep with insulin sensitivity. And the other thing that kind of segues into this is there's a system called the glymphatic system. And the glymphatic system is a system whereby it actually, at nighttime when you sleep, your brain swells. And so what it does is the cerebral spinal fluid will actually squirt through the brain. And what it does is during the day, our body is making a bunch of metabolic waste. And so this stuff gets trapped inside the brain. And what it does is at nighttime, your brain swells and this glymphatic system squirts the cerebral spinal fluid through the brain. And it actually flushes out in between the neurons and clears this area out. It doesn't happen if you're not getting your sleep. So these metabolic products, beta amyloid plaque and such, these things will accumulate in the brain. And this is what causes a lot of these brain issues. So speaking of that, and this beta amyloid plaque, what I've been doing a lot of research recently on is brain health. And what really caught my attention is, as I was digging through this, doing a lot of research, watching a lot of these YouTube videos. I mean, nowadays what's so nice is on YouTube, I can pull up any Harvard professor, MIT professor, and I can watch any lecture for free. So I'm like, this is great. So I spent a lot of my time doing that. And what I found is I started seeing that there was this research out there where they were having this dramatic effect on brain health using light. And we're familiar with the light. We know light is healthy. Without light, right? Plants don't grow. We don't grow. We also know that light, too, generates vitamin D, supports our immune system. If you don't get it, we can get seasonal affective disorder. So we realize that light has always been a big issue. But what's amazing is the type of light. And what I'm really interested in now is the frequency called the infrared. Now, a lot of people are into, and I'm sure you guys are too, this whole detox sweating saunas, far infrared saunas. And a lot of people are into that. I've got one too. I've had one for 20 years now. I love to sweat a couple times a week, 3 to 5 times a week to help detox. But that's the far infrared. What's fascinating now, and this is what's so new, is the therapeutic effects of near infrared. Totally different frequency. What they found is that light therapy produces small increases in something which induces protective responses against it. So I don't know if your audience is familiar with it, but hormesis, or the hormetic effect.
We talk about hormesis all the time.
Great. Well, this is, for example, this light therapy will induce a small burst of reactive oxygen species in the mitochondria. And we know that large amounts of this is very damaging, but this small amount is enough to initiate a large response of antioxidant responses like our glutathiones and superoxide dismutases and such. And this is therapeutic for the entire brain. So we see that this small amount does this. And when I started watching this, I thought, wow, this is fascinating. And then the other part that really kind of blew my hair back too was something preconditioning with the light. And what they did is they would shine this light on these animal models, and then they would do something to the animal to see if this light protected them against what they were doing. And it was amazing. So you mentioned TBIs, these traumatic brain injuries, and we know that there's a lot of this information going on out there, especially in the National Football League with this CTEs, right? Chronic traumatic encephalopathy. And this is what's happening to these professional football players, affecting their brains. For example, Junior Seau from down in San Diego, he had this, killed himself. So we're seeing a lot of this brain trauma.
For our audience that might not know what a CTE is, could you explain to the audience like what would be the pathology of the brain and what happens?
Sure. Okay. So it stands for chronic traumatic encephalopathy. And anytime you hear of encephalopathy, what we think of is swelling, inflammation. So what happens here is when these people get hit, and you don't need to even be hit in the head. It's just when the body is accelerating and then it comes to an abrupt stop. You hit the ground, you hit one another. You don't have to bang heads. Inside the brain actually keeps moving. It's like if you're in a car and your car hits something, the car stops, but you keep moving forward. That's what happens with the brain. And so when they hit the ground, they hit each other, is their body stops, but their brain keeps moving and it bangs against the inside of the vault there. And that trauma creates swelling in there, and that swelling puts pressure on the nerves and it kills the nerves. And if you have enough nerve damage there or neurons that are damaged, then what happens is the brain doesn't work right. And so this is the problem in the NFL. I was just watching a very interesting show where the commissioner of the NFL was being grilled by these, like there were senators and things that were giving him a lot of grief because a lot of these wives of these football players are complaining that their husbands, after playing this sport, are becoming violent to them, committing suicide. And they know that it has to do with the chronic trauma to their head, but nothing is being done. And once you're out of football, you don't have their health insurance and things anymore. And basically, you're just kind of cut loose. And these people are having to fend for themselves, and it's draining all of their finances, and they don't know what to do. And there's nothing out there today that they have anything that's giving them any hope. Matter of fact, so much so that they're actually looking at stopping contact football before you cannot play contact until you get into high school. So things like Pop Warner, Junior All-American, things that I played, and I'm sure you guys did too, they want to stop that. They want to cut that out because they figure, you know what, the less trauma, the less incidence is here. So this is a big deal of what's going on. And what I'm going to talk about today, this light therapy cures that.
That's so interesting. I just wanted to reiterate something you said, just so everybody catches it. You don't need something catastrophic that involves the head. It could just be anything that jars the body a little bit, and makes the brain move in that space against the skull. Correct?
That is correct.
This is not fringe. This is taught in medical school, and I've been hearing about this type of injury since I was an EMT. That's a coup contra coup injury. That's when because your brain is floating in cerebrospinal fluid, and so it's not like against the side of your head or against your forehead. So it's floating to have some cushion, and when the acceleration stops, that brain floats forward and then floats backwards, and then that's how you get a coup contra coup injury.
That's exactly right. What they were looking at is they were really surprised that, for example, if a football player got hit on the side of the head, for example, the right side, they found damage on the left side of the brain, and they couldn't figure this out. And it's because, again, just like you picture in your car, is when you stop, you immediately, first you go forward, and then the body moves in the opposite, it accelerates in the opposite direction. Same thing with your brain. So if you get hit on the right side, first it impacts the right side, and then accelerates to the opposite side, and there's left side damage. So this contra coup is you're absolutely right. But what's interesting is what they did is they actually looked at the players, and you would think of the players in the football league, which position, and I'm going to quiz you guys on this one here, which position on the offensive team do you feel gets the most concussions?
Quarterback.
I would say nose tackle. Well, the center.
A lot of people would think wide receivers because they run out and then the linemen take their heads off when they make the catch over the middle and they get crushed. The number one position, linemen.
Linemen, yeah.
Linemen. Now, what's interesting is you say these guys are not banging heads. They're banging their bodies, right? They're going in. But it's that mass that accelerates off the line and then it hits that other guy coming the other direction, and immediately it comes to an abrupt stop. And every single play, there's these massive collisions, not of their head, but of their bodies. And that is causing most of the damage in the NFL. So it's crazy.
Well, have you looked at other sports? Like, I know cheerleading has a really high incidence of injuries.
Yes, they do, actually. And it's interesting is they're finding a lot of soccer players. What they're finding here now is actually the speed of a ball when they're doing these headers. I don't play it. I've watched it before. But when they're doing all of these headers and they're kicking the ball at, like 45 miles an hour and things, they're actually getting greater concussions than football players are getting with banging heads. So they're very concerned about because at least a football player has a little protection on his head, and the soccer player is hitting it with his bare head. So they're very concerned about that also, and they're actually thinking of taking the header out of the game, especially for younger players, because they say there's no sense in beating them up ahead of time. So there's a lot of this that's really emerging in the athletic arena. Think of skateboarders, motocross riders, BMX riders, hockey players, all of these guys that are getting traumatic, brain issues because of these severe stops and the banging of the head. So there's many sports out there that are also very concerned about this.
This is so interesting to me because, like, for example, sports like rugby have less concussions.
Sure.
And, something happened in boxing that when they started putting gloves on people, injuries and knockouts actually increased because before you would break your knuckles. And once they added boxing gloves, now your knuckles were protected and now you could punch harder. So I wonder if the gear is actually giving you this false sense of security, and that's why, we have seen an increase in TBIs.
You are absolutely right. And what they do with rugby is they might have that little cloth helmet on. But if you watch a rugby player, the way that they tackle totally different from a football player. A football player, you stick your head in and you actually make contact. You lead with your head. When you've got nothing on your head, you're not going to do that. You're going to tackle more of, body tackles and things. And so the reason that it is because you're absolutely right. You don't have that headgear on that you feel is going to protect you. And so therefore, you're not going to lead with your head. So again, this is why the NFL now has spent millions of dollars to try to design a football helmet that would better absorb these impacts. Most of the impacts, it's not your head being hit. So you can have the highest tech helmet, but if your body is accelerating and coming to abrupt halt, you're just hitting the ground. You're still going to generate these repetitive brain traumas, and over time it's going to accumulate, and this is what generates or causes the CTE.
It sounds like you have a solution for this because the nature of the sport isn't going to change. But before we jump into that, you mentioned a little bit about some mood changes that some of these athletes suffer from. What else should they be looking for if they're suspecting that they may be suffering from too much impact?
Well, there's memory loss, alterations in mood, and then suicidal tendencies. And so all of these, drastic, dramatic, personality issues. And these are the things that the wives are complaining to the NFL and saying, look, the person that I married, that's not him anymore. I don't know him. This is this angry, hostile, violent, combative person. This is not the person that I knew. And I've actually watched interviews where the husband would break down and cry, and he's like, I wish I didn't do that. I don't even know what I'm doing. So, it's really dramatic to see this, the alteration in brain function. But those are just some of the issues or the symptoms that one sees when they have this.
Junior Seau was such a sad case because when he committed suicide, he actually shot himself in the heart. And the reason he did it is so he could preserve his brain matter for it to be studied, because he knew that his depression and all his symptoms were because of the CTEs.
Correct. Killed himself, but preserved his brain matter because he wants science to find out what's going on.
So what have you discovered? Give us some hope here, because this is getting sad over here.
Okay, good. Well, let me just explain. I want to talk about two particular researchers. One is Dr. Hamblin. He's out of Harvard, and he also he's a professor at Harvard, and he also works out of the Wellman Center of Photomedicine, so medicine with light. And he's the most published in this area, and we're going to talk a little bit about his work. And then the other one that I want to really talk about tonight is Dr. Liwei Tai, which is a neurologist out of MIT, and she's the director of the Picower Institute for Learning and Memory out of MIT. Both of these simultaneously were doing research on light. Two totally different mechanisms, but the outcomes were the same. A increase in brain healing, decrease in inflammation, regeneration of neurons, increased synaptic connections, increased brain mass, and reversal of amyloid plaque. So amazing, because as you probably know, Alzheimer's right now, there's a greater expense on treating Alzheimer's than cancer or heart disease. And even though there's only 5.7 million people in the United States, 40 million worldwide, it's now the largest drain on the healthcare system. They say if we don't come up with a handle on this, by the year 2050, it will completely have decimated. That's only 30 years away. It will completely have decimated our healthcare system. We won't have the money. By then, it will be costing us over $1.1 trillion to deal with it, to deal with Alzheimer's. And this is the sad part. They've been throwing billions of dollars at this for the last 20 years. 99.6% of all clinical trials have failed miserably. So there's only 4 medicines that are out there. None of them stop it, reverse it. All they do is help you deal with symptom suppression for a short period of time. And then after that, what happens is the brain acclimates to it, and then it doesn't work anymore. And they tell you, go home, get your stuff in order, because there's nothing that science can do for you. But I'm here to tell you that there is.
And I'm gonna tell my audience why. So things like the Exelon patch, which is an MAOI inhibitor, you're trying to degrade those neurotransmitters. So what that drug does, it kind of inhibits the monoamino oxidase enzymes in order to prevent the degradation of this brain transmissions. So your body notices that you don't have as much transmissions going on, or you are having an increase in the transmission of this pathways, and it upregulates the amount of MAOIs it produces. So then you have too many MAOIs, the drug stops working, you take away the MAOI, and now this transmission is even weaker because you kept taking the drug away, and now you have overexpressed the MAOI. So you might maintain the level of the neurological transmissions, but once the drug stops working, you just drop to the bottom and it doesn't work, and now your decay is going to be so much faster than if you had started at without that excellent patch.
So essentially, what you're saying is, it sounds like you end up worse off than where you started.
The decline is faster. You might maintain the signaling for, but once it stops working, you just plummet. And this is, and I've seen this happen. In my family, my girlfriend's grandma passed away from Alzheimer's, and yeah, once that drug stopped working, it plummeted. Let me ask you something, Dr. Hopkins. I know there is a big connection between insulin resistance, and we talked a little bit about insulin resistance at the beginning of the show. One of the nurses, while she was receiving care, she said, this people with Alzheimer's, they lose their appetite and they start wasting away. But you hand them a cookie and it's like they remember and they start eating it. What is the connection between this type 2 diabetes or insulin resistance and your brain creating more amyloid plaque?
Great question here. The key here is they're not really sure what's actually driving this beta amyloid plaque. It's not just found in the brain. It's found elsewhere in the body, and it has the ability to cross the blood-brain barrier. But in the brain, what happens here is you have a precursor protein called the amyloid precursor protein, which is found in the membrane of the neuron. There's two enzymes that will come and they will cleave that. And so what happens here is that when they cleave this enzyme, a small part of it actually exits the neuron, goes out into the extracellular matrix, and this is that small fragment, the amyloid beta plaque. What this does is this is kind of a sticky, and it accumulates and it gloms together, and it actually blocks the transmissions at these synaptic junctions, and it causes neuronal death. So what they're associating it to is lifestyle changes, poor diet, lack of sleep, insulin resistance. All of these factors here that we know are vital for good health are also vital for preventing beta amyloid plaque. Now, what's interesting is the number one cause of Alzheimer's is age, but yet not everybody that ages gets Alzheimer's. So there are other factors involved, and they believe that they found only 10% of Alzheimer's is genetic, 90% is environmental. So these environmental factors that are actually creating this, and this is the other part that's kind of scary, is the body starts to produce this beta amyloid plaque up to 2 decades before you have any symptomatology. So 20 years prior to this, you're accumulating this stuff that's gumming up the brain, but not enough to where it's showing any symptoms. When you start to see these symptoms of forgetfulness, right, all of these issues, memory loss, lack of facial recognition, these things, you are far advanced into the state of Alzheimer's. So this is where some of what I want to talk about today is so important, because you don't know if that's taking place right now. Now, if you have that ApoE4 allele, then that increases your odds for this. But again, at the end of the day, nobody knows. Now, the key here is you just have to assume, because we live in a toxic world, that we are producing this. Now, the nice thing about it is the body has the ability to defend that. We have a particular cell in our brain called the microglial cells. This is the body's innate immune cell that is there to kind of gobble things up, right? It's kind of the janitor. What's interesting with Alzheimer's is this cell becomes dormant. It sits on the couch and watches TV. And our body continues to produce this plaque unabated. Now, what's interesting here is light therapy actually reactivates this microglial cells. That's one of the features of this light. And again, if we have the time, I can explain kind of the mechanism here.
Totally.
But
for it.
One of the features is it will actually re-engage these microglial cells. They've done this in small animal studies. There's things called transgenic mice that they actually create these mice to develop Alzheimer's at an early age, and then they try all different types of therapies on it. What they did, and remember I said that you can do this light therapy is called preconditioning, where you'll shine a light on something and then see if it protected you against something else. So what they did is they induced this plaque, and then they shined this particular light on it, this near-infrared light. And what it did is they went back and they sacrificed the mouse. They looked at that. And after 1 hour treatment of this light therapy, there was a 50% reduction in the beta amyloid plaque. So what they did is they said, wow, we know something is going on, but we have no idea. And what they did is through further research, they realized, and this was the work done by Dr. Li Wei Sai out of the Picower Institute at MIT, is that this light activated or reactivated these microglial cells, and they got to work and they started to gobble up and digest this beta amyloid plaque. So again, what they're finding with Alzheimer's is this slow decline in this microglial cell activity is what allows for this slow buildup until it gets to that kind of tipping point where all of a sudden the bucket overflows and you see the symptoms.
So like this microglial cell, it's like a garbage collector and goes around and destroys the beta amyloid plaque, okay? How was this light administered? Was it like just through, full body? Did they have to shave the rats? Were they just staring at the light?
So you got to wear something on your head?
Great question. Actually, what it is this. Yes, what they did is they took a particular frequency, the near-infrared wavelength of about 830 nanometers, and what they did is they shined it on the head of the rat. It penetrates the skull, goes in, and it actually alters mitochondrial function. I'll explain that in just a second here. But also what it does is these microglial cells are macrophages, right? These are the guys that do this phagocytic work, this gobbling up. What's interesting here is you have other types of macrophages, and light therapy has the ability to convert it from a phenotype of M1 to M2. The M1 phenotype macrophage is actually pro-inflammatory. It's the one that releases cytokines like interleukin 1, interleukin 6, tumor necrosis factor alpha, all of these inflammatory cytokines. This is what happens, but when you shine the light on the brain, it converts the M1 pro-inflammatory macrophages to the M2, and now they become anti-inflammatory, like your IL-4s, IL-10s, right? TGF betas. And these are the cytokines that are anti-inflammatory. So it reduces inflammation. It activates these microglial cells to go out there and start gobbling this up. And it starts to remove the stuff like the tau tangles, the beta amyloid plaques, these things that are gumming up the system. This is light that's being shined through the head. Now, using light therapy, they've been using this for years. They do it in the sports world where they'll put like red light on your arm for like muscle soreness and joint pain. And it's wonderful for reducing that, but they never thought the light could actually penetrate through the skull. Well, this was the work that was done out of my Dr. Michael Hamblin. And actually what they did on small animal studies is they shined the light through, and they knew that it was changing that. So at the University of Toronto, just a couple of years ago, what they did is they put on the EEG cap, you know, the one that's looking at all the brainwave. And then what they did is, prior to this, science said, baloney, light will not penetrate the skull. Well, what they did is they hooked up that cap, and they're watching the screen, and they're looking at all the wave patterns, and then they shine this near-infrared light, and immediately it altered the wave patterns. Turned it off, everything went back to normal. Turned it on, altered it. So they knew for sure that they were penetrating the skull. It penetrates up to about a centimeter. But most of your neurons, the cell bodies, are located in the cortex of the brain. So what it does is, as this light penetrates, here's the deal. What it does is, as you probably have talked to many of your podcasters, is that probably the common denominator in all chronic illness is poor mitochondrial function. Would you agree?
Oh, yeah, 100%. You know, like cell danger response. You know, having high mitochondrial volume increases longevity. If you have low mitochondrial saturation or volume, you can't create ATP. So chronic fatigue syndrome. There's plenty of papers about how important mitochondrial function is.
If you can't make energy, you can't do the things that you need to do in the body.
100%.
Yep.
And so this is what right now, medicine now, this is like the hottest thing in alternative medicine, is if you can affect the mitochondria, you can reverse, change things, help people heal from these chronic illnesses, heart disease, cancer, and all of these other kind of exotic diseases, that the only thing that does that is increasing the energy. And I kind of liken it to like a light switch, a dimmer switch. If you dim the switch, the power to the light goes down and the light barely glows. What happens here is our mitochondria in our brain, actually what happens here, and again, this is kind of geeky, but if we remember kind of the electron transport system, and if you're talking about the terminal enzyme, the fourth one, cytochrome C oxidase, what it does there is that's the one that reduces oxygen to water. Now, what happens here is nitric oxide binds to where oxygen should bind to. You have these two metals of copper and iron inside at the core of this terminal enzyme. And nitric oxide, which is a free radical, binds to it and has a greater affinity than oxygen. And therefore, oxygen is not allowed to bind to this, and it slows down. It's a dimmer switch, and it dims the mitochondria. Now, what's interesting, and this is when they did this light therapy at Harvard, they saw that it was helping these rats. They were getting rid of beta amyloid plaque. They were repairing their brain. Actually, what, and I'll kind of jump to this. I'm kind of fired up about this stuff here. Is so what happens here is when this light shines through, There's something called a chromophore. A chromophore is what actually accepts the photonic energy. The far infrared saunas, water is the chromophore. It absorbs the photons, it heats up the water, you heat up from the inside out, you sweat, boom. That's the deal. But in near infrared, it's not the water molecule, it's the cytochrome C oxidase. And when it absorbs the photonic energy, it excites that copper ion core and it actually dislodges the nitric oxide. There's the magic. So the nitric oxide, which is a free radical, binds that and it gums up the system. Oxygen can't bind. When the light hits that, it excites the oxidative state. And nitric oxide now no longer has an affinity to it. It gets dislodged, and then oxygen can bind, and the dimmer switch goes up. Now, also, too, what they found is when they were doing this light therapy, they saw that it increased the diameter of the vasculature in the brain by 100%. And they're like, holy smokes. What is doing it? It was the release of the nitric oxide, as you know, which is a vasodilator. So now this light therapy, not only does it turn up the dimmer switch, and now it makes your mitochondria at full RPM, but it dislodges the nitric oxide, increases vasal circulation, increases this M2 phagocytic activity, and all of these things. It also releases small bursts of reactive oxygen species, and this hormetic effect increases the antioxidant function. All of these features are taking place when red light is shown on the brain. So what they found here is this, and again, this was in animal studies, is if you look at an Alzheimer's brain, it is significantly smaller than a healthy brain because so much of the brain cells have died that the mass has shrunken. Here's the magic. After the light therapy, the brains regrew all of those neurons, and it had the same mass density as a healthy mouse. So the interesting thing here is we never thought that, right? I mean, we were taught that you damage brain cells and that's it.
And they'll never regrow.
Not the case. They're finding that this light therapy will actually stimulate neurogenesis and synaptogenesis. So now we're increasing our synaptic connections, which is where memory is stored and such. So we're seeing all of these amazing things, and this is the research that's being done out of Harvard and MIT that is actually showing the most promise for reversing Alzheimer's. Now, the beauty of this is they found that if you precondition, and they took this in small animals, and they said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to do this light therapy, then we're going to introduce this beta amyloid plaque, and we're going to create Alzheimer's. What it did is it actually protected them from happening. It protected from brain shrinkage. So not only does it reverse it, but if you use it as a therapeutic, as a prophylactic, it can actually prevent this from happening. So that's the amazing thing in that. And also the exact same work they found out is if you precondition the animal and then you initiated a TBI, there was significantly less damage. The healing time was significantly faster. So what I'm all excited about, and I told Billy, is I'm working with a company here where we're actually developing one of these tools that's going to deliver this light to the brain with people with strokes. It reverses the damage of strokes, PTSD. They're having phenomenal results with this. The Boston VA, Dr. Nasser, which is a neurologist out of there, also teaches at Harvard, is working with the military and the VA, and they're working with patients with PTSD, and they're reversing that. So all of these neurological issues that we just figured, like strokes and PTSD, part left to do other than just let's make them comfortable, not the case anymore. So you can reverse it, and you can, if you use it before this takes place, you can actually either significantly reduce and possibly even prevent yourself from getting this. The neat thing about this is there's no toxic side effects. Now, it is dose dependent. It has something called a biphasic curve, meaning not enough energy, you get no results. You do it too much, you lose all the benefits. So there's this sweet spot that if you use the right frequency for the right time duration, you get this magical repair of brain tissue. So this is the work that's being done, and there's a term called photobiomodulation. Have you heard that before?
I've read a little bit about it. Like there's a couple of companies like the Spurdy Light and all those far infrared, but I've never heard about the short infrared light.
Right. Well, this near infrared, this is where the magic is, and this is something that I've been really high on, and telling Billy about this is that I see so much potential. And again, I love doing the work that you guys are doing, working with the endocrine system, working with diet and things. But this has just kind of really got me excited about this.
Well, it's super cool, because as much as we try to, counsel our patients and trying to make all these changes, people are still human, right? And a lot of times, you mentioned that Alzheimer's is multifactorial. Sometimes they're doing everything right, and what the big culprits are kind of fall by the wayside. So this is really exciting stuff you're talking about.
Well, the cool thing about multifactorial disease is that, like, for example, it could be multifactorial. It could be maybe being exposed to toxicants and having a shitty diet and not being, and having TBIs and things like that. But there is no reason why the cure can be just a single silver bullet. Now, I'm a big fan of evolutionary medicine and looking for like the mismatch, and because it is not a maladaptation that we are developing this amyloid plaques, or it is the correct adaptation for the wrong environment. So, have you ever thought about like, did in nature, before we became confined into houses and going to work from 9 to 5, do you think there was like an exposure of near infrared light that we just completely caught by using fluorescent light bulbs, or do you think that do you know if at any point in our evolutionary history were we exposed to near infrared light?
Well, again, the near infrared is basically infrared is the light that you feel. When you're sitting in your car and the sun shines through, and it can be cold outside, but you feel that nice warmth inside, that's the near infrared that you're feeling. So it's been around since the beginning of time. It penetrates through glass, it penetrates through these things. I just think that these other factors of our poor lifestyle choices, like Billy was talking about, lack of sleep, insulin resistance, all of these things, chronic stress, chronic inflammation, poorly functioning mitochondria, and then deficiency in vitamins and minerals. And you just put that whole thing with our pollutions and the toxic buildups and all of this kind of stuff. And it just creates the perfect storm. And I think that this is just one of those issues. But the likelihood that we're going to be able to clean up our environment and get everybody to do this thing, as you're going to find out, Billy, as I did, it's really challenging to get people to alter their lifestyle.
It's really amazing, the capacity that we have to just ignore doing all the things we need to do. And, I hate to say it, but in a lot of people's cases, they just need the shit to hit the fan. And like you're saying here with Alzheimer's, you don't really have that because the pathogenesis occurs decades before the manifestation of Alzheimer's. And so it's really unfortunate, but you talked about this, part of the mechanism of this being sort of a hormetic response, and so you don't want too little, you don't want too much, you want this Goldilocks sort of zone. So what does that look like?
What they're looking for right now is, if you're using this near-infrared light, the frequency is in the 800 wavelength range or band, and you're looking at the power density, which is the amount of power that's exhibited per area. And they're using very low level. It's not high. It's not in the watt range. It's in the milliwatt range. And then you only need to do it for about 20 minutes. And so you're applying a wavelength for about 20 minutes at a very low wattage. And this is what's great about, well, first of all, near infrared is invisible to the human eye. So what's interesting is it generates no heat. And so you can put this on, it's very comfortable. And if you dose it properly, all of these effects at the cellular level we were talking about, changing macrophage activity, changing the releasing of the nitric oxide, increasing ATP production. All of these things are amazing things that happen. And again, this is at a low level, a low dose. And these are small scale studies, of course. But what they found here is in 12 to 16 weeks of using this 3 times a week for 20 minutes, people that had not been able to speak a sentence, been able to feed themselves, couldn't recognize their loved ones, were eating, talking in complete sentences, and recognizing their family members. I mean, we're talking dramatic turnarounds. And this is the amazing thing. And again, the three of us and your listeners too, is we're all about first do no harm. And that's the beauty of this type of therapy, is there are no toxic effects to it. And so again, we're just applying something that's out there, and the benefits are just amazing.
Have you worked with any patients using this technology?
Actually, I've got a few people using it, a few family members and things. I've been using it myself and seeing some changes, in better memory. I've been doing it on myself. Naturally, you always got to self-experiment, right? And I'm actually feeling my memory is certainly improving. Absolutely.
Do you have any recommendations for any commercially available products or lights?
That's a great thing. And actually, the company that I'm helping design this for is going to have something out this year. The unfortunate thing is most of this stuff right now is being done in the research labs. And so, these are devices that were made specifically for the research institute. And so there's not a whole lot of stuff. You can get bulbs and you can get your own near-infrared bulbs and put it next to your head and things like this. But, you have to actually get the benefit, you want to pulse the waves. And this pulsation is so important because it's something I didn't get to talk about. And you guys just tell me when to shut up, okay? And I will.
No, it. So, maybe that's the thing. By looking at the research and by being able to help bring a product to market, maybe when this product hits the shelf, maybe we can have you back on the show and talk about all the different features and why this would be the best way of starting off with some light therapy. Super interesting stuff. I know there's a lot of people that are suffering from anywhere from depression to TBI and concussions, and you have all of these different things that could be applied to.
Yes, and just a couple other things just to kind of, whet your appetite on this is it has a phenomenal effect on reversing age-related macular degeneration, which, as you know, is the primary cause of blindness in adults. And also, too, what's amazing, and we've known this for a long time, is that this near-infrared light has an amazing way of stimulating the stem cells in the bone marrow and increasing their number and their activity. So you can increase your body's own production of stem cells by actually shining the light on your long bones. And they're doing that right now, and they're having phenomenal results there. So I think, according to Dr. Hamblin, and again, he's the most published on this. He has over 300 publications, and he's the professor out of Harvard. He says in the next 4 to 6 years, he believes that every household in the United States will have some sort of a light device as a healing modality in their home.
Imagine if we can make like dual bulbs and like just have them like in your classroom and you pulsate the light, throughout the day to generate more neuron connections.
Well, they may find that that's not a bad idea. And again, this is something, what's nice about this is the treatment time is so short. It's only a 20-minute treatment time. So it's not like, again, more is better. What they found is that more can be actually worse. Not that it creates any kind of a negative health effect. What it does is it just negates the gains that you had made. So if you think of kind of the bell curve, on the low end, no effect; on the high end, no effect; in the middle, great effects. What they found is when they continued to apply this, that eventually all of the great benefits went away. So this is part of the whole research thing, is finding out what is, as Billy said, what is that Goldilocks, sweet spot to deliver this. And this is still part of the research. They're having great effects with strokes, PTSD. They're also having phenomenal results with autism. And again, they're finding that there's a disconnect between the frontal and the parietal lobes, and this light therapy actually will reconnect those connections. And so they're seeing some great, preliminary results coming out of the autistic community. So I think that this is going to be some pretty amazing stuff here in the future. And again, why I'm so high on it, there's no toxic effects. There's no side effects to this, other than you just may erase all of your benefits because you did too much, but you're never going to hurt yourself. And that is amazing.
We see this with any hermetic stressor, like, for example, you talk about fasting.
Or lifting weights.
Lifting weights, exercise, anything that is creating a minimal damage that your body can overcome and become better after. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Usually, if you do it too much, you will eliminate the benefits, and instead of having a hormetic stressor, you're just going to have a stressor.
Correct. And again, our body needs stress. We need that. That's why you go to the gym. That is a stressor on the body. Most plants, the benefits of the plants that we eat are the chemicals in there that are low-dose poisons. And it actually initiates the hormetic effect. So again, it runs, all through our planet, and things like this is not enough, not good. The perfect dose is just right. But again, I'm excited about this.
Well, I think everyone listening is going to be super excited. Thank you so much for this interview. We're running like around an hour right now. So if people have more questions about your research, if people have more questions about your upcoming developments, where can people find you, Dr. Hopkins?
They can't.
I could hardly find the guy, man.
So it's so funny because usually when I have someone come into the show, they're like, "Oh yeah, these are my handles. You can find me on Facebook. You can find me on Instagram." But you are unfindable. What about like a website, or what about an email address?
Yeah, I mean, if somebody wanted to email me and ask me some questions and things, of course that would be fine. Once I get this product to where it can go to market, then I will have a website that will accompany that and things. So right now things are in the design phase, and it will be going to production within the next couple of months. Hopefully we'll have a working unit before the year's end. God willing, if everything goes well, we should have that done. And then at that point, I'll have all of the ancillary material to support that. But right now, that's also in the queue. So as far as finding me and things, if somebody wanted to email me, that's great. And I'd be glad to answer their questions and things. Or if you want to down the road, if there's enough interest, we can do another talk on these things. So whatever you'd like.
Excellent. So maybe I can grab your email address before we leave, and then I'll put it on the show notes. And if someone really, really wants to talk to you, they're going to have to dig for that information.
Yeah, let's make them work a little bit, okay?
Yeah.
Let's not make it easy on them.
Excellent. Thank you so much for all this great information. Billy, where can people find you?
You can find me on Instagram. My handle's @therobusthuman. That's TheRobustHuman. That's why I went to medical school, because I couldn't spell. Or you can find me at my website. It's the same, therobusthuman.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much, guys.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Dr. Hopkins. Hurry up and get that machinery out, man. People need it.
I will, and thank you guys.